Galicia, 1950s. The damp air seeped into the stone walls of the small house where a boy of barely 14 understood, for the first time, that life would give him nothing unless he tore it from its grasp. Amancio walked silently through the narrow streets of Leon, carrying a bag of cheap bread and a contained rage. That morning he had heard his mother begging in the shop, "We can't give you more credit, Mrs. Ortega, not until your husband pays the overdue balance." The boy said nothing, but the shame burned on his cheeks like a hot iron. The shop assistant, her apron stained with flour, had spoken those words as if they were knives, and all the customers had heard them. That echo would be the starting point of something he did not yet understand, but which would haunt him until the end of his days. He returned home and found his mother bent over a table, sewing shirts for others. Her fingers bled, the needle glinted under the dim lamp. "You will work with me," she said without lifting her eyes. And that was his initiation. The needle as weapon, the fabric as sentence. Every stitch was a reminder of how little they had and how much was expected of him. At night, when the silence became unbearable, Amancio repeated to himself, "Never again will I allow us to be humiliated." It was a promise born of hunger and darkness. The early years were a parade of gray streets, poorly ventilated workshops, and bosses who treated him like a nameless ghost. He learned fast. He observed how clients demanded impossible suits, how wealthy ladies insisted on fabrics brought from Paris while he barely touched the leftover scraps. He did not speak much, but his gaze absorbed every detail, the pleats, the seams, the whims of the rich. One day, while delivering a package, he overheard a man in a cafe say, "Luxury is not in the price, it's in the illusion of having it before the others." That phrase was tattooed in his memory. In his rented room, with an iron bed and an empty wardrobe, Amancio began to dream of a future in which ordinary people could dress with the speed of the elite's fashion. But in those years, he was only a silent apprentice, swallowing dust, heat, and contempt. The first risk came disguised as desperation. He was barely in his 20s when he decided to leave the minimal security of the workshop to sew on his own. There was no capital, no backing, only a dangerous idea to manufacture cheap housecoats and sell them door to door. His sister helped, his first wife too. It was a fragile business, a flame exposed to the wind. Fear was constant. With every roll of fabric he bought on credit, he felt the weight of an invisible rope around his neck. If he failed, he would not only ruin his own future, he would drag his family down with him. There were nights he could not sleep, imagining creditors pounding at the door, demanding what he did not have. The first clients were humble housewives, women who looked at him with suspicion. "Who are you to sell me this?" They seemed to ask without words. One of them laughed at the sight of the gown. Too simple, too cheap. That rejection pierced him like a spear. He returned home with burning eyes and empty hands. But he did not give up. He adjusted the patterns, improved the seams, learned to read people's gestures before they spoke. Every failure was a secret manual. Every humiliation, another page in the book he was writing with sweat. The first breath of relief came on a rainy afternoon. A client agreed to buy not one, but 3 gowns. She showed them to her neighbors, and within weeks unexpected orders began to arrive. Small, irregular, but enough to keep the flame alive. Amancio, however, did not celebrate. He knew that spark could go out at any moment. The real test would come later. When he tried to convince local shops to display his products, many dismissed him. "You are nobody," they said. "Your gowns have no name." That word name obsessed him. He realized sewing was not enough. He needed to create a symbol, something that could travel faster than him, farther than his hands. Meanwhile, loneliness became his companion. Amancio was not a man of parties or speeches. He spent hours locked in his small workshop, listening to the hum of the sewing machine as if it were a heartbeat. The outside world seemed to ignore him, but within those walls, a concept was being born that would change the way millions dressed. Victory, fragile and almost invisible, came with the opening of his first store in La Caruca in 1975. There were no luxuries, no dazzling shop windows, only simple, well-made clothes sold at a price people could pay. The store gradually filled. A woman tried on a dress and smiled at herself in the mirror. That gesture, so simple, was for Amancio the confirmation he was not mad. He had found a path. But even in that moment, as he counted the takings with trembling hands, a doubt pierced him. What if no one comes back tomorrow? What if all this collapses? That question would haunt him always, even when the world called him one of the richest men on the planet. The La Caruca store became a small beacon in the shadows. The streets still smelled of dampness and coal, but inside that shop there was something different. Movement, curiosity, a murmur of satisfaction. Yet Amancio did not allow himself euphoria. He walked among the shelves like a paranoid guardian, fearing everything could fall apart at any moment. His nights remained dark. He woke startled, thinking of debt to suppliers, rent, wages for the few employees he had hired. Fear was an invisible guest, always sitting at the table, always breathing on his neck. Soon he discovered a new enemy, society's distrust. Many pointed at him as just an improviser, a man without a prestigious surname, without a university degree, without connections. They treated him as an intruder in a world reserved for others. Each remark was a cruel reminder of his humble origins. And yet, within that apparent weakness lay his strength. While department stores took months to bring in new collections, Amancio began to listen closely to the pulse of the street. If a client asked for something different, the next day the garment was already in the window. That speed, born of necessity and obsession, became his secret weapon. The second risk was even greater. He decided to expand, to open more stores. Voices called him mad. "You will ruin yourself," they warned. "You cannot grow so fast." But the memory of his mother, begging for credit in the shop, would not let him sleep. Amancio was not seeking recognition. He was seeking to shield himself against humiliation. Every new opening was a wall against the past. The obstacles grew alongside the opportunities. Once, an international supplier rejected him brutally. "Your orders are too small. You are not worth it." That phrase haunted him for weeks. He walked through his warehouse aisles, repeating to himself that one day the entire world would kneel before his orders. That promise was not vanity. It was survival. The workers saw him as a distant man, almost invisible. He never allowed himself to be photographed, avoided interviews, slipped away from celebrations. He preferred the silence of the factory to the noise of glory. Some criticized him for being cold, others for being secretive. But Amancio knew that showing himself too much was risking someone discovering his greatest secret. He still felt like that boy humiliated in the bakery, unable to get credit for a piece of bread. Time gave him his first great victory. Zara began to resonate in the streets, in homes, in conversations. It was not luxury, but neither was it vulgarity. It was something new, accessible, and desired. The queues in front of the stores were silent proof that his idea worked. Even so, every registered box, every dress sold, carried with it a dark echo. What if everything disappears tomorrow? The 1970s and 1980s were a battlefield. Competitors tried to imitate him. Bankers looked at him with suspicion. Journalists sought him relentlessly. Amancio remained in the shadows, watching, weaving an ever wider net. The world saw an empire being born, but he only saw risks multiplying. One night, closing one of his newly opened stores, he was left alone in the empty shop. The floor still shone from cleaning. The mannequins stared into the void. Amancio sat on a wooden bench and allowed himself a thought that rarely visited him. I have won something. It was not yet wealth, not power. It was the simple fact of having proved he could defy the fate that seemed written for him. That moment, brief as a sigh, was his first real victory. But the climax of his rise was not accompanied by jubilation, but by vertigo. When Inditex began to expand outside Spain, the fear became unbearable. He was entering unknown terrain, facing giants with centuries of history. Every international contract signed was a double-edged dagger. It could open the doors of the world or sink him forever. The sleepless nights returned with greater force. He paced back and forth in his house, staring at clocks from different time zones, imagining ships laden with merchandise sinking in the middle of the ocean. Success did not free him from fear. It chained him to it more tightly. And yet, he pressed on. Because he understood ambition is not a fire that dies with achievements, but a hunger that intensifies with every bite. The first great confirmation came when he saw his name, or rather Zara's, written on a New York storefront. He did not travel to see it, did not pose for the press. He simply received a photo and remained silent. No one knew that night, alone in his office, a tear rolled down his cheek. Not of joy, but of relief. He had crossed an invisible frontier, had defeated another shadow. Years later, the world would recognize him as one of the richest men on the planet, but Amancio never felt like a king. He saw himself as a survivor, someone walking on a glass bridge that could break at any moment. In old age, when the press tried to extract words from him, he answered with silences. He did not seek statues or biographies. He knew his true story was not in the headlines, but in that morning as a child, when he heard his mother could not pay for bread. Everything else was the consequence of that wound. The final reflection is simple and brutal. The price of the first step never disappears. The initial fear becomes a companion that follows you even when fortune seems infinite. The world may see it as inspiration, but for him, it was always a scar. If that teenager had accepted humiliation as destiny, nothing would have happened. But he chose silent rebellion. He chose to take risks. And that risk, tinged with loneliness and doubt, was the true origin of Inditex. Today, the lights of the stores shine in hundreds of cities. Thousands of people wear garments born of his obsession. Yet somewhere in his memory, Amancio still hears the echo of that shop assistant. We can't give you more credit. That voice became the engine of an empire. And also, the shadow that never left him. In the end, that is the dark and eternal lesson. The first victory always tastes of blood. And though the world applauds it, the one who achieves it never forgets how much it hurt to earn it.